When it's celebrity headlines, they're entertainment. When it's family members, they're infuriating and confusing. When it's our neighbors, they become gossip. What are they? Abusive relationships. 1 in 3 women have experienced them, and 1 in 4 men. And yet, despite how common they are, we still act as perplexed onlookers when the victim stays, goes back into the arms of an abuser, or leaves one to find another. My next guest is someone who experiences this weekly in her office. She's a licensed mental health counselor in Florida who specializes in assisting women in recovering from trauma and toxic relationships. Today, she's going to explain the intricacies that create the love hate scenarios that trap people, why not all abuse includes bruises, and how we can actually help and be helped as we ask the question, why do people stay with their abuser? Professional listener, returning guest, the soothing voice of reason, Melissa Garner. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be back. Thanks for having me. Such an important topic.
It is an important topic, and I think in order to understand why people stay, we might need to paint a picture of why or how people even like arrive in the abusive relationship. So, are there
Yeah,
certain types of people that are more vulnerable to abusive relationships than others?
for sure. I would say so. And that is that I want to make sure that it's clear and by no fault of their own. These qualities also make up a very lovely relationship if matched with the right person. But I will say that abusers do look for people that are easier to control in a sense. So they're going to be looking for the peacekeepers and the optimists and the passive communicators, right? The ones that are willing to compromise, which again are excellent traits if you're in a healthy relationship, but can quickly be taken advantage of by someone who's looking to do that.
I heard a cult leader quoted on a podcast saying that he always knew who his next victim was because he'd physically like bump into them in the street. And then if
Um,
that person apologized, he was like, oh, that's my next person.
Which again, you would think conscientious and polite behavior would be a great thing, and it is. But unfortunately, it can make one vulnerable to someone looking for those very traits to take advantage of. A lot of people don't realize that they are being abused, and sometimes it's sort of gradual as far as integrating itself into the relationship in the first place. So yeah, some people can be surprised to find that what they're going through is not normal.
Well, that's what I was curious about because it is gradual. Sometimes, like in retrospect, when you hear these things explained, it seems very intentional. It seems very pathological. Are abusers usually systematic in how they choose and implement the systems of control in a relationship?
So not all abusers look the same. I would say that the old adage can ring true that hurt people hurt people. Sometimes that is the result of their own trauma that has not healed and then gets projected onto this other person as a form of feeling powerful, right? Because abuse always comes down to a sense of power and control. And again, there's different reasons people want to feel powerful and control. Some of those reasons were because they didn't have any sort of power or control in their own lives growing up, and maybe they were the victim of abuse. And this is how they've learned to cope with it, unfortunately. Other abusers are very calculated, and this is where you're going to see more narcissistic personalities and antisocial personalities, and sadists, where the goal is to find someone to hurt for different different rewards.
Interesting. Yeah. So the drivers are different, the awareness is different, but sometimes, I don't know, would you say sometimes or always like the method is similar? Because,
Mm,
going back to that analogy of cults, and I've heard abusive relationships described as even like a 1-to-1 cult
sure.
and
Oh, yeah,
love
that's a good way to
bombing,
put it.
breadcrumbing, trauma bonding, grooming. Have
Yes.
you seen a lot of that in your practice with the women that you work with?
Oh, unfortunately, a lot of that. That really is my specialty, and so I see a lot of it. Yeah, there's different types of abuse out there, and some are very obvious. You would think, physical abuse is a very obvious form of abuse, and that's where you're going to perhaps see signs of abuse, bruises, cuts, broken bones, burns, things like that. But some abuse is obviously not very obvious, and that's going to be where you're going to see emotional abuse, psychological abuse, right? Where the goal is to turn oneself against oneself, right? Sort of to break down one's own trust and their ability to depend on themselves, right? Or to trust their emotions or how they even think, right? So emotional abuse is meant to use your emotions against you to get what I want. Right. So if I can butter you up and make you feel good so that I can have something from me, great. If that's not working, maybe I ramp it up and move on to badgering and hopefully break you down that way. Or maybe a guilt trip will do the trick. And then beyond that, it can move into pretty serious types of manipulation, threats, temper tantrums, violence, punishment, and
Yeah.
retaliation. Right. And then there's other kinds of abuse as well: sexual abuse, financial abuse, right? Relationship abuse, where one is just isolated, right, away from their friends and family, or discouraged not to pursue higher degrees or an education or training, right, not to work, right. Sometimes abuse and control is under the guise of I want to take care of you, but also along with that, I want to control you. I want to make sure that I'm the only one that can take care of you.
I've seen a lot of that, of just over my years of doing business with women. I was in their kitchen. We were talking about skincare and makeup, and women will disclose a lot when they take off their mascara for some reason. And so, yeah, there was one lady I met here in Pensacola, and she told me that her husband doesn't allow her to make any purchases. And when she goes to the grocery store, when she's at checkout, she has to call him and tell him the total, and then he
Hmm.
wires it into like a debit card. She was, a character, and so I kind of took it with a grain of salt. But then one day at Publix, no lie, I happened to be behind her in line at the checkout, and I
Hmm.
saw it.
Hmm.
And it's just wild because I don't think people understand the scope of like financial abuse and what that looks like. And it
Right.
does masquerade as caretaking, like people who have said, "Oh, he doesn't want me to work. He just wants me to pursue my passions and or stay at home with the kids." And it's like that sentence alone can be quite innocent, but it also can be a sign of financial control.
Yes, and a big giveaway would be as if this person wants to go do something to better themselves, right? So nothing wrong with wanting to stay home with the kids and take care of things or be taken care of. It would just matter, of course, at what cost, right? So if I'm going to be taken care of, does that mean I have to put up with a lot of abuse? And so if that's the case, then it's obviously not a deal. So again, the telltale sign of whether this is a controlling and abusive situation is if the individual who wants to pursue their individual freedoms is somehow criticized, ridiculed, or prevented in some way from doing that very thing, then we've got a problem, right? Because we don't want to necessarily blame anybody for wanting to be extra generous, but again, both parties would need to be on board with that, and not just one calling the shots.
Yeah, there's a lot of subtleties in the dynamics of abusive relationships. I'm glad that you explained the financial abuse more because it's one that I think doesn't get talked about a lot. Um, but can
Yeah.
you kind of explain or define what emotional abuse is? Because it's one that can be extremely damaging. As you said earlier, it's like you don't even trust yourself anymore because your judgment has been outsourced for so long that
Mm-hmm.
you have, just learned to depend on this other person for all of your thoughts, for your critical
Absolutely.
thinking.
And in an abusive relationship, that is systematically done, right? You can't trust yourself. You have to trust me. So again, whether that's overtly said or implied through actions over time, the message is clear that the abuser knows best and they should be in control. The result would be ultimately walking on eggshells, right? Because emotional abuse, it can be screaming, yelling, calling names, ridiculing, constantly criticizing, right? We got to be open to feedback, but this would be constant criticism. Everything you do is wrong. And then we can get into threats and isolation and right. So emotional abuse is meant to attack a person's trust in themselves, their self-esteem, and again, that it eventually is effective. So I think a lot of people try to not let it get to them. sometimes a little barrier, right? I'm not going to let it get to me, or I don't let it bother me, or it doesn't hurt anymore, which of course, right? When something that's meant to be painful doesn't hurt anymore, it doesn't mean it's not causing harm. It just means that we might be numb to it. So emotional abuse is a very sneaky type of abuse, but has incredible and profound effects on a person's self-esteem and their ability to trust themselves, which is of course very difficult when it comes to deciding what to do about the relationship itself. Right? The gaslighting becomes their own language. I can't really trust myself. I'm too sensitive, right? Um, I need to grow a backbone, right? These are a lot of the gaslighting, the minimization thoughts that were fed in an abusive relationship where my feelings are, they don't matter, or I'm just too sensitive and I need to get over it, right? As opposed to
Ooh,
this is a problematic environment and I'm not safe.
wow, those are really good examples. I've seen emotional abuse where the compassion is leveraged. So,
Mm,
like the person was saying to this woman, he was like disclosing all these personal, emotional secrets. He kind of created like a bond that way,
yeah.
like I'm so broken and you're the only one that can heal me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, if you basically don't do what I say, I might hurt myself. Who knows what I'll do?
Yes,
Who knows what would
absolutely.
happen to me? And so that's like a real sneaky way that I've seen it show up too, because it wasn't in that case as overt as put downs. It was actually putting that person was putting himself down in order
Mm-hmm.
to adhere his wife to him.
Sort of feigned helplessness, victimization, right, for the purpose of seeking out that kind of trauma bond, right? I need you to take care of me, right? I need someone to keep me in line, right? You help me be a better person, right? And so very much that's like music to some people's ears, right? I want to be helpful. I want to make a difference. Maybe I can love them into changing. And of course, if they're validating that, "Yeah, I need you to love me into changing," well, then you got a perfect recipe for this to continue on to a pretty destructive level.
Yeah, and then they're not incentivized to actually be better because then you'd be like, oh, my work here is done.
Well, absolutely. And that's how a lot of people end up in sort of the abuse cycle, right? Which can gradually integrate itself. It can start off very minimally, but gradually get worse over time because of both people being involved in that cycle, right? One person to essentially struggle with, let's just say we all deal with emotion and stress. That's part of being human. Let's just say an abuser may not have a great deal of emotional regulation skills, and so when that abuse shows up in the relationship, whatever kind of abuse that might be, let's just say some sort of an outburst or violent action, right? Obviously there's going to create some damage. Some distrust happens in the relationship, and that's usually we're going to see distance, withdrawal, right? The hurt party is going to withdraw generally, or the abuser may hurt and then pull away as well as part of the abuse itself, right? So it's your fault I have to treat you this way, right? So I'm going to now
Mm.
neglect you to add to that, right? So that in that distance, of course, the I'd say that the hurt party has generally the most power in these moments, right? Because they are hurt a lot of the time in that distance. Sometimes the abuser will eventually come back to close that distance with apologies and eyes are wide open to insight, right? And so suddenly we might get all these grand gestures and some love bombing, and I see the light, and I'll never do that again. And right, lots of promises, and again, music to someone's ears who really looks forward to change, who only wants things to get better. And then things do get better for a little while, and that's maybe we maybe see that honeymoon period for some time. This is when maybe some loved ones, family members, friends, they don't understand the reunification during this time. And this is when sometimes the external relationships, such as friends and family, start to get more distant, right? Or feel pushed further back, right? Because it's you all don't understand what that I love him and we're working on it and he promised he'd change or he has changed and so again the distrust not only affects the relationship itself but people around the relationship as well, right?
Mm.
So things return to routine eventually and the whole cycle repeats itself getting
Never
better.
thought about the connection between the reunification and the emotional response that
Mm.
happens with the support people and how
Mm.
that actually creates more of a gap, and more
Sure.
isolation. Because I've experienced that when I've been a crying shoulder to quite a few women, and then I
Yeah.
help them, and then they go back. They
Right.
go back to the guy that was, in one case, physically choking them. It's hard not to go, okay, well, fine, and we'll talk
Right.
more about that at the end about how we can
Mhm.
support others. So,
Yes.
but I want to kind of transition into why we stay, or why people stay in abusive relationships. We mentioned like extreme examples like cults and stuff. I think there's just this temptation to think of abusive relationships like the Elizabeth Smart case, like, oh, they must be held in a basement somewhere just waiting for the opportunity to get out. But it's
Mm.
not that cut and
Right.
dry. Over the years, being trusted with disclosure
Mhm.
and not knowing, always how to help. I wanted to get your take on the yeah buts that
Okay.
I've personally heard, and maybe you can expand on them or share other examples that kind of bring this into light. And the first one is a big one. It's a big but. It's
Okay. Okay.
yeah, but he's never hit me.
Sure. Absolutely. That's a really common one, right? If I were working with a client, we would really take our time with that. So, because I wouldn't want to get into a back and forth of trying to convince someone why they need to leave, right? Because that's a quick way to lose that person's attention pretty quickly. When it comes down to it, even if you're not being hit, over the years, the women that I've spoken to, the people that I've worked with, oftentimes refer to the emotional impact of the abuse as worse in some cases than the physical. I can't speak for everybody, of course, in that sense, but again, a bruise generally heals a lot faster than the self-esteem. So I would say that an emotionally abusive relationship is just as detrimental as a physical one, and really, you can't have one without the other. Even emotional abuse takes a physical toll on a person's body.
Another yeah, but I've heard is yeah, but we're married, so it's not rape.
Mm-hmm. Right. So rape is unwanted sex, right? It's sex against one's consent, whether you're awake or asleep, or whether you are married or not in a relationship. Sexual abuse is any unwanted touch, right? Even if one has changed their mind, even if one is married, right? So everyone has the right to say no, and everyone has the right to what happens to their body, even in
Yeah,
marriage.
but if yes, that's true. Yeah, but if I tell someone, it'll ruin his life.
I would just speak to the fact that that's part of the abuse cycle itself, is sort of the protecting the abuser of the negative consequences of their abusive behavior. I would encourage people to let the pieces fall where they may, that the abuser will deal with the consequences of their own behavior, and that by speaking up or reporting it, that the person is taking care of themselves.
You see that a lot in military families because a report of the abuser has an impact on the abuser's career.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
sometimes, because of the nature of being a military family, they're already isolated. And so
Right.
that can create um, an added fear component of some practical fears. So
Absolutely.
let's kind of unpack those reasons, because I think we're kind of getting into that neighborhood of the categories that you want to share:
Mm-hmm.
emotional, cultural, and practical. So
Yes.
do you want to start with practical since we're kind of on that topic anyway?
And so there's practical reasons that people may not leave an abusive relationship, or it may be difficult to leave one, is just like you said, that perhaps reporting a spouse may result in that spouse's employment being affected, which then affects the household income, which then affects perhaps the kids, the pets, the people involved in the home. It's not always a clean break, as you just pointed out, right? It's an uh, untangling of, right, one's enmeshment with this person. So practical reasons can include lack of resources, right? That if you're leaving the abuser and they were the only source of support, such as finances, emotional support, companionship, right, shelter. That's a big ask to go find those things for oneself when you're already in a state of emotional turmoil. So just a lack of resources in general to money, shelter, childcare, support, emotional support, counseling, things like that can be a major factor. It's not having the ability to leave. And sometimes disability is another issue entirely. Not just difficulty leaving, but the inability to. Say somebody who has a physical or mental disability puts them even more in a vulnerable position to be taken advantage of. So obviously that makes it more difficult to leave. Um, Practical reasons would also include just the logistics, right? So what does that mean as far as where am I going to go? If do there need to be any legal proceedings, right? Does this mean some sort of a divorce or a legal separation? Where are the kids going to go if there's kids involved, pets? So it's going to be an overwhelming process to even think about. So that's why I say, when working with someone or talking with anyone who's in an abusive relationship, one of the best things you can do is help them listen to themselves, ask questions, let them speak, let them hear themselves. Because that is so important because they haven't been in touch with themselves probably in a while.
Yeah, that's major. I never thought of that. Just to let them speak freely, like give them a space to process their thoughts out loud.
Yeah.
I once met a woman who had some sort of mark on her. I forget what it was, but I asked about it, and she straight up told me that her man abused her. And I was like, and it was within the first 10 minutes of meeting, right? Like I
Oh,
was
yeah.
thinking, oh, this will be a funny story. This will be a good icebreaker after we shook hands and we're literally like, nice to meet you. And we were in a private space and she must have just felt some kind of way. And she admitted after that, after she said, oh, yeah, well, my man, I forget how she worded it, but basically beats me. And I said, oh, okay. Something to the effect of, well, why don't you get on out of there. And she admitted that, well, he pays the bills and
Yeah.
takes care of my kids. He never lifts a hand on my kids and pays the bills. And I don't have a
Right.
lot of options because I do have so many little ones. And so, in your experience with your practice, do you find that people who are facing practical barriers to leaving their abuser are more aware of the abuse than those who are not leaving for the other reasons?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'd say that if they've reached the point they're considering the practical barriers of leaving, then they may have already moved through some of the emotional. I've heard of many, many stories just like that, right? That the utility of the relationship in a way offsets the abuse that they're experiencing. And to them, it's worth it to sort of sacrifice themselves for the stability of perhaps their children or the family dynamic. Yeah.
I
Or
think that
because,
perfectly
right.
illustrates the cross section of psychological and physical abuse. Because
Mhm.
if you recognize the abuse and yet still accept it from a psychological standpoint, that, as you said, the utility of it, the payoff, then you are, you know, right where that abuser needs you to be for their
Mhm.
own, you know, benefit. um, Another thought process after people have moved through that emotional piece can
Mm.
sometimes be like the impact on the community. Like you've been gaslit for so long, and then you finally realize, oh, this is not right. But then you work through the practical, but then you've got this like, well, what will my parents think? Or can you speak to
Right.
the cultural nuance of what keeps people in abusive relationships?
Absolutely, right. So if we grew up around abuse and toxicity, we may just think that's just normal. That's how relationships work, right? So, I'll hear that, right? Where people may normalize, well, we scream and we yell and we call each other names, but that's just what we do in our household. So normalization through family of origin or gradually integrates itself into the relationship itself, sort of like we were talking earlier, maybe just little things in the beginning and gradually get worse over time. Society, right? Friend groups, right? Don't want to upset the friend group dynamic. I can't tell you how many adults I've spoken to who and kids, teens who have validated, I wish my parents had split up. Because
Oh,
living in that
really?
kind of, I wish they had split up or I wish they had
Oh, wow.
separated earlier. Because of course, right, leaving and having parents who are separated, it has its effect for sure. It's a challenge. It's not the ideal scenario, but staying in an abusive environment and relationship has extremely detrimental effects. So it's not necessarily better for the children just to stay in an abusive environment relationship. In some ways, it can be more detrimental. Um,
I'm so glad that
so,
you brought that up because I know your specialty is working with women, and so we're speaking from the vantage point of what you're best at. But I just
sure.
want to speak really quickly to my male listeners
Yeah.
because um, I feel like there is a double standard in our society of what women will tolerate in a relationship or in what they are encouraged to tolerate or not tolerate and
Hmm.
what men are. And I
Yes.
just want the men out there to know that it is not cute when she is crazy. It's
Right.
not part of her sexiness. It's not okay that she puts a tracker on your phone or calls you a bunch of times or is checking all your, stuff
Hmm.
or keying your car.
No.
Yeah, maybe the
Right.
makeup sex is really great afterwards, but just if you're listening out there and you're a guy, I just want you to know that if you leave at a relationship like that, that doesn't make you a bad man, doesn't make you a bad father, doesn't make you, from a broken home. It makes you breaking the the spell of future generations thinking that's okay. So I just wanted to put that out there.
That is a really good point. And I agree, right? We think about abusive relationships, and I think a lot of us conjure right, the image that comes to mind is the male is the abuser of the women. And it absolutely goes both ways, right? Right. And so, yeah, absolutely. The control tactics are similar. Um, like you mentioned, several tracking, stalking, demanding, right? Checking on everything you're doing, right? It's not okay. So,
Yeah,
a healthy
crying if you don't
relationship.
get your way, like just bursting out into tears instead of having a normal adult conversation,
Mhm.
just, going into a fit of sobbing is can
Mm,
be very manipulative. And I think that there's a lot of, men out there that just put their identity into a fatherhood and being a husband. Like, who am I if I'm not this?
sure.
And
Yeah.
that kind of is an example of the end psychological consequence of this
Mhm.
chronic state of walking on eggshells and, crisis in the home.
Right. Because you end up with sometimes you end up with sort of the abuser and then the passive one, and either gender can be right. So and then sometimes you end up with two that uh, use hurt to get their point across.
Yeah. Was there anything on in the Department of Culture that you wanted to also bring out, or do you want to move into the emotional reasons? Because I know there's a lot of those.
A lot to say about emotional reasons. Yeah, I think we covered cultural. I think a big one can also include, of course, spiritual beliefs, religion beliefs. Right? So where essentially everybody else is telling you that you have to stay regardless of what the abuse is, for whatever reason they think is important. I think one more thing that can cycle into cultural, which sort of segues into the emotional side of it, is the sort of sunk cost fallacy, right? Like, I've come this far. How could I turn back now, or how could I leave now? We've gone through so much together. And that's, again, I'm going to speak some to the trauma bond, right? We've been through so many traumas together. That must mean something about us, right? And so that can almost cause a person to want to double down on the loyalty to an abusive relationship just because of everything they have come through together.
Wow, yeah, that's major. Do you see that as a reason that people end up marrying their abuser? Like they've dated for a long time, then they get married, and even though, oh, this is your chance to, exit, they
Hmm.
instead lean into it because they've come this far. I could definitely see that in like a religious community.
Absolutely, yeah. I've worked with many people who, right, their abuser, they will both go to their spiritual or places of worship and put on the show and then go home and treat each other terribly,
Yeah, that's
seeing
true. I
problems
heard
where
that
they really exist.
I heard that called the dinner party paradox. Like when you're at the dinner party, you're playing a part, and
Yeah.
then you get in the car to go home, and it's like a switch turns,
Yep.
and you become, how you are at home, whether that's distant or, argumentative or whatever it is. It's like it's a different version of yourself, public to private.
Absolutely. Right. The mask comes off, and so
Emotional.
emotional,
Let's go into that because that's a biggie.
of course. There's a lot that goes into deciding to leave an abusive relationship. I'd say one of the first ones that comes to mind is just a not knowing or simply denial of the abuse, right? Where we can minimize it, right? We can minimization or numbing is really a barrier to leaving an abusive relationship, right? So I don't want to feel if I'm in an abusive relationship, so I'm going to numb somehow. I'm going to just turn those feelings off, and there's lots of ways to do that. I can, right? Drugs, alcohol, shopping, eating, maybe go start my own little affair on the side, right? So all sorts of things can lead to distraction, which again, if we're not looking at the problem, then it may not bother us as much.
Can you give an example of that abuse being minimized? Because I think I'm
Mhm.
just imagining someone who might be in an abusive relationship listening to this
Mhm.
because they can't trust their own judgment about their own
Mhm.
situation. They might need some, a picture painted that they can paint
Mhm.
themselves into and figure out if that's them or not.
I've worked with people where well, they call me names. They call me horrible names, and they scream and tell me terrible things about myself, and and they're just smiling and laughing, and tells me, "Well, I don't it doesn't even bother me anymore. I just expect it at this point." And again, that's danger zone. When we have gone numb to things that should hurt, we're at risk of getting really hurt, right? Because that pain is a good thing. It's built into our instincts to sort of teach us what's dangerous, right? So if that signal has been turned off somehow by either willful, I can just take it, right? I'm tough like that, and almost taking a sense of pride, and I'm not going to let them get to me. But if someone is being abused, rather than leave the relationship, they might find somebody else who makes them feel a little bit better, right? And then, of course, now we have shame and guilt, and now they feel they deserve the abuse they're getting at home. So it's almost fair.
Yeah, I mean, that's like positioning yourself so you feel deserving of the situation that you have, removing the
Yeah.
contrast of who you really are and your
Yes.
situation so that your world
Mm,
makes sense. I
mm.
mean, I don't think you could have explained the complexity of abusive relationships better than just that one example. Yeah, that's very eye-opening.
I'd say some other emotional reasons. One of the biggest ones, of course, would be fear. Fear shows up in a lot of ways when thinking about leaving a relationship. Fear of being alone, fear, again, in an emotional sense and in a practical sense, right? Who am I going to spend time with, talk to, who's going to make me feel less lonely, or who's going to help me take care of these kids, who's going to help me pay these bills, right? Fear of leaving and retaliation, right? So the abuser obviously generally don't like being, they don't generally like it when people leave. So, again, retaliation is a risk. And so there's fear of that, fear of how it's going to affect everybody else around them. So fear is
Yeah,
a
I could
major,
see that.
major
Just even
player.
the fear of am I capable? Depending on how long that person has been with their abuser, like in the case of grooming, in researching before our discussion, I was listening to all different kinds of examples because you kind of just don't know what you don't know, right? Someone was talking about they were 16 and he was like 18 or 19. And then, supposedly they didn't start dating until she was 18, but she was groomed up until that point. And so he had a huge influence in her own understanding of who she was as a person.
Sure.
And that dependency was still
Hmm.
created in those early years so that when she did, become of age, it was like he customized her to his
Hmm.
liking, and
Right.
she couldn't have any other way of seeing herself outside of that relationship because it had been so overshadowing for so long.
Exactly. And had a part to play in her development, even as far as growing into an adult who she is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anything
So,
else
and
under emotional?
sure, yep. I'd say guilt is a major player here. Right, guilt. Oh, right. I don't
Guilt's a big one.
guilt, guilt for everything. Right, and again, a lot of caregivers, a lot of the people pleasers, a lot of the ones that like to take care of everybody else. We tend to be a little predisposed to guilt. Right, we want things to go right, and for whatever reason, if they don't, it's my fault. So, of course, that excessive sense of responsibility is going to lead someone to feel guilty all the time, whether something's within their responsibility or not. And so, guilt can play a major role as far as I'd feel guilty for upsetting this person that's been abusing me. I don't want to upset them. I feel bad for them, right? I don't want to add to their stress, right? So we might have a lot of empathy and love for this person, and which then translates into guilt for upsetting them in some way. Obviously, guilt for if there's kids involved, right, and how that's going to affect the children if I leave. Um, so guilt's a really big one, and that ties into shame as well, right? So guilt, I don't want to do anything wrong or upset anybody, but and then shame is really a characterization of oneself, like I'm a bad person, I'm a failure in some way, right? Or I should have left sooner, I didn't, so this is my lot in life now, right? I've missed the boat. Right, so there can be a
Oh,
lot of shame and
yeah.
embarrassment, right? Or we've split up, right? And then going from that picture perfect family, right, of the, what did you call it? The dinner,
The dinner party paradox.
the dinner party paradox, right? To go from this picture perfect to suddenly I'm leaving this person, right? There's a lot of it, um, a lot to fill in there, right? So, and I know that a person leaving a relationship is going to feel a lot of pressure to explain this to everybody and a great deal of fear of not being understood by the people around them. That, what do you mean? I thought things were perfect.
Yeah. Or worse, oh, you didn't see that coming? Didn't you see the red flags?
Right,
I think it's
right.
Dr. Ramini,
Yep.
Dr. something like that. She has a YouTube channel a lot about narcissism, um, but she talks about how she's on an anti-red flag campaign at the moment. And when I heard that, I was like, well, why would you not want to tell people like what the red flags of an abusive relationship are? Like most of the websites that I've been to that are helpful in that way, in fact, have a bullet list of red flags. And she said it was because she feels like it puts too much pressure on the victim to be in charge of all of that. And it just is too much pressure. And so after a person leaves, instead of, oh my God, I can't, instead of the dinner party paradox, there's something opposite, like the didn't you see the red flag paradox? Like, oh, yeah, we knew, like, and how hurtful is that? So the
Yes.
victims of abusive relationships, whether it's emotional, financial, or physical, there's so much aftercare that has to happen. So I'm so glad that,
Right.
there's people like you out there that understand the scope of it and can be
Right.
a resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's another fear, as you pointed out, is leaving a relationship that's abusive, and someone coming along and saying, "Well, I told you so," right? What took you so long, right? They obviously nobody needs that kind of shame when they're trying to make a good decisions for themselves, a very hard decision. So, and then I'd say that the last thing I'll say on emotions for now would be again sort of that longing for better, right? I remember the good times. I remember who they were before the abuse began.
That's so
So,
true. Well, let's talk about how to get out.
yeah,
Because I heard another statistic about that time frame of getting out can be very dicey, and
yeah,
that a very large percentage, I think it was 70% of women who are killed by their abuser, that it is during that time frame of like
mm,
leaving the abuser. And
right,
so I think it's I say that, not to discourage people from leaving, but
right,
to have a plan,
yes,
and both a practical and an emotional one. So maybe since we're
yes,
kind of in the neighborhood of emotions, let's start there. How do you recommend someone who is processing the guilt, shame, identity loss, grieving what the relationship was? Like they're
right,
grieving the death of a
absolutely,
relationship, and I
mm,
don't think that's something to be ignored.
right.
How do you suggest someone process? that cluster of emotions in order to move into the practical steps that they need to leave safely?
Well, I'd say first and foremost to reach out to someone, right? And if friends and family feel distant because of the isolation, because of the nature of the relationship and how that's caused some tension, to seek out counseling, right? That's what we're here for. We're non-biased, right? We're here to help. We're here to sit with you until you work through what you need to do, right? So, and a good counselor is not going to pressure you, nor guilt you, nor shame you into making a decision right now, right? So, I would say that reaching out to support. I would also encourage someone to, as far as the emotional aspect, to work on getting in touch with their emotions. Again, with this kind of a relationship, it's always about the abuser and how do they feel, right? Watching their mood, mitigating their blow ups, mitigating the abuse, right? So walking on the eggshells. The sight is always on how do they feel. Like let's make sure that they're okay or calm. And we lose total sight of how do I feel? What do I want? Who am I? Right? So I would say spend some time journaling about those things. Who am I? What do I want? How do I feel? Right? And that can be a painful process. There may be some painful emotions. So what I would also encourage is extra self-care, right? Spending the time, the energy, the resources, whatever it is to take care of your mind and your body. And again, not doing that alone. As far as creating a safety plan, like you mentioned, absolutely. If if the abuser has a propensity for killing, then that is going to be something that's it's going to be a dangerous time to leave, right? So to really put together a safety plan, people can use incognito tabs to search out resources, right? Delete your history, right? Because again, sometimes control and abuse involves stalking what you've been doing, looking at your computer tabs. Really great resources to reach out to as far as creating a safety plan would be the hotline.org. And the phone number for the actual hotline for abuse is 800-799-SAFE. But the hotline.org has many resources that someone can find as far as how to create a safety plan, how to get in touch with advocates, how to get in touch with local resources. So yeah, I'd say that the first steps would be in creating that safety plan is figuring out who your safety team is going to be. Right? Who's
Who
on your
should be on
side?
the
Who
safety team?
so it'd be the counselors talk to you. They can speak to victim advocates in the local community. Go to hotline.org and speak to advocates there. So people who are ready and willing to help. That can also include, just depending on the area, right? It can include state or government resources, agencies set up for victim advocacy.
I have become concerned about families that are more and more using, oh God, what is it called? It's the apps. Apple has one built in where you track each
The
other.
tracking,
Yeah,
yes, like
and
Life 360 and
Life 360 and stuff like
yeah.
that. I'm like, y'all, this is a terrible idea. Why
You think
you're doing
you think
this.
so?
But it's under the premise of safety, which in a healthy relationship, I'm sure that's fine.
Yes.
But you know, how can somebody who is in an abusive situation
Mm,
kind of mitigate these tracking devices? If you shut it off, they literally get a notification. And
mhm.
sometimes these tracking apps have been downloaded without the person's knowledge, or there's
Right.
a literal, I mean, this is old. This was like 10 years ago that one of the local organizations in Pensacola was telling me that sometimes there are literal trackers physically magnetized underneath the vehicle of the person that
Uh,
they're being stalked by. So they
right.
had like a service where you could bring your car to them and then they would search it and they would search
Oh,
your phone. But not everyone has that. So how are they
yeah.
supposed to like reduce how much they're being watched without alerting their abuser and potentially escalating the abuse?
Right. That is the scary part. As far as tracking and things like that, one wouldn't know, right, if they're being tracked secretly. So I would probably encourage them as, and again, this is all going to sound super easy and simple, which I realize it's not so simple or easy to some people. But right, survival is tough, and so to do whatever you can, right, whether that's borrow somebody else's phone, if you can get out of the home to go to the library, use their computer. Um, Drive straight to the police department and ask what kind of services they can offer. So yeah, if you feel that your stuff, your phone, your car is being tracked, to see what you can do to borrow somebody else's or get in touch with someone else. Yeah, or
That's
take yourself
smart.
to a safe space. Yeah, it
Financially, how should they be prepared? Because we talked about financial abuse, which is a major system of control.
right.
If that person is restricting your access to
Hmm.
funds, certainly you can't pay for counseling or put gas in your car
Right.
or do anything. You are forced to interact with that person in order to survive in a modern world.
Yeah, as much as possible to begin putting money away if you have any access to money to start putting that away.
And where should they
To
put it? Because, like, I I interviewed one lady that put it in a box of, like, bran something oat bran cereal because she said no one likes oat bran cereal,
okay.
so no
Yeah.
one would and it worked. She would stuff money, actual physical bills in the, Raisin Bran, I think it was Raisin Bran, cereal box, and that helped her escape because that was a very severe situation, and she had to literally escape from that.
Yes.
So, do they need to go get them a Raisin Bran cereal box or open up a different bank account? Like, what's the best move there?
Right. I would encourage them to gradually be putting together a little go bag, which, to keep that somewhere where it's not suspected or to be found, right? Which, is going to be different for each individual. But yeah, to be creative, make sure that it's not somewhere that's going to be found. And in that go bag would be stashing money away as you come across it little by little, as well as legal documents, important documents that you want to make sure you have with you that you can't go without, such as your ID, passport, birth certificate, things like that. Change of clothes, right? Any medications you need, and to have all that ready for when it's time to go. And then, of course, once they have left, as soon as possible, to go ahead and establish a bank account. Now, if they can do so safely before leaving, I would encourage them to do that. Again, it depends on the safety of the situation. But yeah, I'd be careful about opening accounts too, just because those can come in the mail as far as account statements and welcome letters, that sort of thing. So to be
Oh,
mindful of
that's a
that.
really good point.
And then as far as, because like you said, cash, we got to have some sort of money to function, to survive. And so I would encourage them to look into local resources, shelters, churches, charities, right? They're food banks. They generally are available in different areas. And so 211, at least in, I believe, the US, if you dial 211, not 911, but 211 is going to connect you with local resources to help with things like getting you established with healthcare, childcare, shelter, and even vocational rehab to help them get back into working and making money.
You mentioned documents, which is such a good point to have
Mhm.
the documents that you need. What about creating documents that create some sort of trail of evidence for legal proceedings?
Mhm.
What's the best way for someone to do that? Are you allowed to like legally record phone calls or in person, you know, confrontations? Kind of like, is there a standard operating procedure for how to make sure that you don't do all this and then just to be shot down by a judge? Because, like, in the example
Right.
of some of the technological stuff that we were talking about, cyber
Mhm.
stalking is not recognized as a crime in all states, I don't think.
Mm.
And so there are certain pieces of evidence that you have to show, like to get a restraining order or
Right.
to allow you to get custody of the kids because in
Yeah.
a huge power disparity, like say the person is a high ranking military person, a police officer, an attorney, someone who's
Mhm.
well connected, and you have been the stay at home person for like
Right.
ever, and you are not at all connected to anybody, which was
Right.
apparently by design. That gap is such a huge disadvantage for the person who's trying
Yeah.
to shore themselves up in order to create a new life.
Absolutely. Right. It can be like starting from scratch for sure. Yeah. Except not really, right? Because they're starting at a disadvantage now, right? With a whole lot of broken heart and a lot of other logistical issues. So So I can't necessarily speak to the legality as far as whether it's legal or admissible in court, but I would encourage a person to keep as many records as possible. Keep text messages, write things down when they happen, take pictures if there's any injuries, right? If there's items that have been broken, right? If you've taken video, keep it, right? Absolutely. If it's not admissible, it's not admissible, but better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So yeah, I'd say that keeping a record of the abuse is going to be really important. Not to say that that's necessarily a healthy thing to keep in a healthy relationship, but again, if we're dealing with an abusive relationship and you need to leave it, and this is going to support your case, then absolutely keep records as soon as possible.
If you were to summarize like the top one or two mistakes that people make when trying to leave an abusive relationship, what comes to mind? What have you seen? Like, feel free to give a real example if you have one.
I would say it's hard to say call this a mistake, but I would say that I'd say most people, when leaving an abusive relationship, the statistics say that most people attempt to leave 7 times before officially leaving. So I wouldn't call it a mistake, but I would say that that's common, right? So I want to normalize that if someone's had a hard time leaving once or twice or 3 times or 6 times, to not necessarily see that as a failure, right? But again, I don't want to call that a mistake so much as people trying their best in a relationship, right? It's hard to say what the other person's going to do. I think a lot of people blame themselves. So I'd say that's a mistake. Don't blame yourself for the abuse ever. You didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't fix it. Or to, this is something else I've seen where I'm just going to get counseling for the kids, but not myself. And so I'd say another mistake would be to just neglect self care and assume that this is a fresh start for you. There's going to be some healing that needs to take place. So I'd say it'd be a mistake to just skip that self care and the healing process that you'll need. Otherwise, like you
Yeah.
said in the beginning, we may be set up to go right back into another relationship that's not healthy unless we work on ourselves first.
How can we help people who are disclosing to us? I shared that I've had
Yeah.
numerous women, for whatever reason, decide that I was the right person to tell. And I'm sure that I failed them. I mean, I hope not. I hope I helped them a little bit, but I replay these conversations in my mind a lot because
Yeah,
I'm not a mental health professional. I'm just a person who has therapist vibes, like it's a little bit like
you do.
mom vibes, but not a mom, therapist vibes, not a therapist. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And if you are someone that people just kind of share their deepest, darkest secret to on the regular, I think it'd be helpful to kind of know how to help them at different stages.
So I'd say a lot of active listening, a lot of how do you feel about that? What are your thoughts about that? What do you
Okay,
want?
so wait. So you're saying we shouldn't be like, girl, oh my gosh, and then like blurt out that son of a bitch, we blah, blah, I'm gonna get him.
Right.
Like you're saying, don't do that.
Generally, sometimes that can probably be validating, but um, we run the risk if we respond like that. We run the risk of either and causing them to feel as if they're at fault for this relationship, that this is right so clearly terrible, and how could they not see it? And we don't want to instill any sort of shame, right? Because these things are not always obvious from the inside. And then the other thing it might do is put them in a position where now they feel like they have to protect and defend this person. And they probably don't want to do that either, especially if they're talking about how they've been hurt by them. But that can sometimes be a natural reaction to shut down or make you feel better. Oh, no, no, no. It wasn't that, right? Don't worry about me. So, yeah, as much as possible, to again sort of help them connect with how they feel about the whole thing, right? Because they may just be disconnected or numb to it entirely. And if they're not ready to face the reality that these things are not okay, then again it may shut them down entirely. So I'd say that active listening is the best possible thing you can do. Show appropriate responses, right? So we don't want to have no emotional response at all, of course, but nor do we want to normalize or have a great emotional reaction, like you were saying. It can be really hard to be on the outside and watch someone you love being hurt and having no control or power to change that. Of
Yeah.
course, you want to
Well,
reach in and wrap them up, but can't
yeah.
make that decision.
Because time moves in like slow motion for those family members because you're looking, or that those
Yeah.
friends, because you're looking in, going, oh God, if we could just remove this poisonous person out of the
Yep.
picture, we would all be better. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's, easier said than done. So if somebody does have a friend or a family member who is clearly abusing, is the only course of action to be an empathetic listener, or is there other things that they can do in
Yeah.
order to kind of help that person realize, hey, there
Yeah.
are better options out there?
Yes. So active listening is a big one. I would encourage them to go to counseling. If I was meeting somebody, I would encourage them to talk to somebody, right? So again, which is also going to help them talk and hear themselves. I would avoid ultimatums, of course, that it's them or me, right? It's them or our friendship, or it's them or we're never going to talk again. Now at the same time, right? Because those ultimatums come with the implication that, or the expectation that they end the relationship, right? And of course, if they don't end the relationship, now we're going to have tension and conflict in this relationship, right? You didn't meet my expectations of leaving this person, and therefore I'm angry at you now. And now they've got their abuser and now their best buddy or whoever angry at them for being in this terrible situation. So we want to avoid punishing, we want to avoid shaming. Now, at the same time, I will say for people on the outside, it's natural to feel angry and it's natural to feel hurt and helpless. It's okay to take steps back from time to time, too, not as an ultimatum and in a sense of trying to get them to make a decision, but to step back as your own sense of self-care and boundaries, right? To recognize, you know what? This is not something I have control over. It's ultimately not my call whether this person stays or leaves this relationship. There's only so much I can listen to as far as the abuse, right?
Do you think, that it would be appropriate, or I don't know, subtle enough if like you had a friend or family member in an abusive relationship to listen to a podcast and you're like, "Oh God, this would really help them." And maybe it's not overt. Maybe it's like a podcast about somebody's story, like it's a true crime podcast or something.
Mhm.
Because like those are very well shared among women, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm not really into true crime, but a lot of people are. And so people will recommend them to me all the time. And I'm like, it's not my bag. I don't want to say I'm sorry. But because that is normal in our society now, and because podcast listening, unless somebody has an invisible tracker of all your movement on your phone, podcast listening is anonymous, right? Like Google doesn't have a great rep, Spotify doesn't, but those other apps, they do. So, unless like that person has access to your app and can see your listening history, like it's anonymous. It's not going into a browser or something. So like
It's good to know.
would that be would that push them away, or do you think that might help because it's an outside story coming in that that person can kind of relate to in a scary way and go, "Oh my god, this is opening my eyes." Or am I just in fantasy land that that podcast will save the world?
Well, let's hope. Nothing wrong with reaching for the stars. I mean, it depends on the situation. I think that sending information, sending podcasts, videos, articles, the hotline.org, resources, right, all can be really helpful. You just want to sort of also keep in mind the rapport, right? So are we bombarding them and putting a ton of pressure to make a decision right now? Too much pressure, we can sometimes push them right into the arms of the abuser even further. Yeah.
Before we share our final resources and wrap up, is there any other thoughts that you want to get out there?
I would encourage whoever's dealing with an abusive relationship to start paying attention to themselves, right? And there's nothing selfish about self-care, right? There's selfless, there's selfish, and then there's self-care, right? Where if I'm selfless, I don't matter. And if I'm selfish, nobody else matters, just me. But in self-care, everyone matters, right? And I am responsible for me, and I'm not responsible for anybody else. But if I can take care of me, I can function the best in my relationships. And when leaving or going through a really tough adjustment, you can have a plan. It can feel overwhelming. So I just encourage them to focus on one breath at a time. If it ever just feels like too much, just make it to the next breath and then the next one.
That's awesome. So hotline.org,
The hotline door, the
211.
hotline.org. Yeah.
Oh, the hotline.org,
Yep.
211 is loveandrespect.org. Is that for teenagers or is that for, because they have like a quiz that you can take? Is my relationship healthy? Or they used to anyway.
Yeah, loveisrespect.org, I believe, is tied in, and it's, I believe, it's sort of tuned for young adults. Love is Respect. But the hotline.org, there's a lot of overlap, and they have really great information, resources. I do believe they still have those quizzes. And then the phone number, if you want someone just to talk to or to develop a safety plan together, the 800-799-SAFE.
For people who are in the state of Florida, you conduct virtual counseling
Yeah.
appointments. Are you taking clients? How does that work?
Yes. So I am licensed as a mental health counselor here in Florida, and I do virtual sessions only at this point. And I'm working with primarily women at this point. Main specialties include depression, anxiety, trauma, abusive relationships or coming out of abusive environments, and then different forms of anxiety, different anxiety disorders as well. PTSD, phobias, OCD, things like that. And I do take insurance. Right now, I am taking TRICARE, United Healthcare, Aetna, and Cigna. I'm hoping to add on to that in the coming year. So yeah, if anybody's interested in working with me, they're welcome to reach out to me. They would submit a application to my website. It's www.self-haven. So it's got a little hyphen in the middle, self-haven.com/private-session. And I'll reach out and we'll go from there.
Thank you. This was awesome.
This was a lot of fun and such a great topic. Thank you so much.